for this invitation. I really like this idea of discovering linguistics and linguistic discoveries. In fact, it was a discovery for me too. And I will start with a brief, well, Anna already spoiled my journey surprise about Europe. Since in the description of the series, it says that the focus is on the journey that linguists take to find what they're searching, I thought about starting with a map of Europe. So starting from Sicily, where I was born and I grew up. Then I studied in Siena, my BA and MA. Then Cambridge, my PhD, where I actually met Anne. And then first postdoc in Oxford, second postdoc in Manchester, third postdoc or university assistant position in Vienna, then Freie Universität Berlin, and then finally, since 2019, Helsinki. This is not just to show you, how exciting and varied my journey has been during my career, but also to say that many aspects of my work, my research, have also been influenced by the places where I have been. And I have to say that those that had a stronger impact or influence were those where I studied, so Siena and Cambridge, but I will talk about this later. So I work within the theoretical framework of generative linguistics, more specifically the cartographic approach. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but you have a kind of example to the right-hand side, what just one functional projection of the syntactic tree could look like under the cartographic approach, which is trying to map all the functional categories in this syntactic trees representations. But I will go back to this point later. The empirical basis of my work is Romance languages, in particular Sicilian, Italian, and other dialects of Italy. And as Anne also mentioned, my research areas are syntax, words of the variation, information structure, especially the notions of focus and topic, pragmatics, discourse markers, evidentiality, immutativity, and grammaticalization, and so on. So for this lecture series, I gave the following titles. Today, we are going to see the theoretical aspects of the lecture series, and the title of this lecture is actually When the Answer You Seek is Within You, Syntactic Theory Introspection. And that's because I'm going to introduce this idea, this approach or methodology of acceptability judgments or grammaticality judgments. So really the main point of view is the speakers, so the speaker's knowledge. And that's the general methodology that has been used within the generative grammar. So then in the second lecture, I will talk about a shift in my methodology or the methods I use to approach acceptability judgments. So numbers matter, quantitative experimental studies, where I think that what happened in my career can be seen also as a shift in the field, going towards more naturalistic and complex data, just an individual introspection. So then in the second lecture, we'll talk more about quantitative experimental methods of investigation, always related to syntactic variation. And then in the third and last lecture, reinforcements arrive, syntax and interfaces with meanings and sounds. I'll be talking about interfaces with syntax. So main tenet or main assumption in the generative grammar is that syntax plays a fundamental or the most important role, but more recently there's also been attention to interfaces, especially to semantics and pragmatics, so meanings, or prosody, sounds. And also that also has affected my work more recently. So it will be this kind of journey going from introspection to experimental studies and then interfaces and taking notions and theories from prosody and pragmatics and semantics to work on syntactic variation. And you already know the dates. So the empirical basis of these three lectures is just two phenomena. I decided to concentrate on two phenomena, which are focus fronting and polar question particles in the dialects of Italy. So why these two phenomena? So of course, I haven't worked just on this, but this has been accompanying me for my whole career. So since my PhD, there were chapters of my PhD thesis. And then I've been going back to these topics exactly with these methodological changes. So I first started with introspection, and then I did some experimental studies on this phenomena, and then I applied also notions and theories from other areas, like especially pragmatics and semantics, but also prosody. I will briefly introduce them now, but I will go back to them towards the end of this lecture. So focus fronting is the placement of the focus constituent of the sentence to the beginning, like in the example, in the Italian example, Stefano hanno invitato alla festa. So Stefano, they invited to the party. And you can see the progression in my work. So going from introspection, grammaticality judgments, then experimental studies, comparative analysis, and then interface it with pragmatic semantics and prosody. The particles that I've been investigating in the dialects of Italy are found in polar questions, and they're like homophonous to the WH word what. So you can see an example from regional substandard Italian. Che l'hanno invitato Stefano. So did they invite Stefano? Well, with this particle, you can say what at the beginning of the question. Also in these cases, I started working on these particles based on introspection, then grammaticality judgments of other speakers, comparative analysis, and then finally interface with pragmatics. But this is the outline of today's lecture. So we'll start with a short introduction of generative grammar, and of course it will be quite short. I will just introduce those notions and concepts that are important to understand grammaticality judgments and syntactic variation. So we'll refer to some crucial notions within the generative enterprises and then the architecture of the grammar. Then I will move to talk about intuitions and grammaticality judgments, which is used as source of data within the generative framework, and then syntactic variation. And then, as I said, I will go back to the two phenomena I've already mentioned from the perspective of my early work, meaning my PhD thesis, my PhD studies. So, but let's start with the generative framework and a few concepts. Probably some of you are already familiar with them, but will be just a revision or something new for those who have never heard about generative grammar. So first of all, Noam Chomsky, the founder of generative grammar, conceives grammar as a theory of language. So it's not a prescriptive grammar, it's not a set of description rules, but a theory of language. And the reason why it's called generative is because the main goal is to arrive at a set of rules that are capable of generating the non-finite or infinite number of possible sentences of a language and providing them with the appropriate structural description. So he also wants to explain the most distinctive aspect of human language, which is its creativity. So Chomsky is a structuralist, but at the same time is an innatist because he believes in this innateness hypothesis. So the idea that the general principles of a language, so regarding the nature of rules, organization, the principles by which they function, and the kinds of representations to which they apply and which they form, all constitute part of Anna is covering the word with the view gallery, sorry. Okay, now I can see my slide. No, it's my view thing. Part of the innate condition. So there is an innate system that allows speakers to learn a language and to speak. So this is the so-called learnability problems that Chomsky wants to solve. So the gap between knowledge and experience, so between what one knows and the apparent lack of substantive input from experience. So essentially, Chomsky is wondering, how is it possible that children are so good in learning a language and they do it effectively and also quickly when the stimulus, the input they are exposed to is quite poor, so the poverty of the stimulus. And the idea is that there is some kind of innate linguistic capacity that at the beginning was called language acquisition device, and then later UG for universal grammar, that helps children do that. What is more important is that the distinction between competence and performance, because generative grammar focuses on competence. So speakers and hearers' knowledge of a language, as opposed to performance, so the actual use of language in concrete situations. So the fundamental aim in linguistic analysis of a language is to separate the grammatical sequences, so those that are grammatical, from those that are ungrammatical, so they're not part of a language. So this is a main difference with other areas of linguistics that instead concentrate on the external language. So from competence to performance, we can also make this distinction between external language and internal language. So the external language consists of a set of well-defined sentences, deals with sentences actually produced, so with corpora, describes properties of such data, and it is concerned with what people have done. Whereas the internalized language or internal language, which is the main concern of generative grammar, consists of a system of principles, deals with knowledge of potential sentences, so intuitions, and describes the system in an individual's mind and is concerned with what they could do. So competence is what generative grammar is about, linguistic competence. Within these assumptions, it's important to define the architecture of grammar within generative grammar, so the role of syntax. So syntax plays a crucial role, so it's the main component of the grammar in generative grammar, because it's actually the system generating sentences. So the syntactic rules and principles of a language are formulated without reference to meaning, discourse, or language use. So this means the syntax is autonomous. It can be studied in abstraction from meaning or function. So in 2 and 3, you have 2 famous examples from Chomsky. So colorless green ideas sleep furiously. So this sentence, speakers of English can judge this sentence as syntactically grammatical, even if it doesn't make any sense. But 3 instead violates the syntactic rules of the English language, so it is ungrammatical, and this is marked with the star symbol. And I really like to bring this example from Alice in the Wonderland, which is actually going to the same direction. So this is taken from this poem, the Jabberwocking. And what is really interesting, so in 4, is what Alice says about the poem. So when Alice has finished reading the poem, she gives her impressions. It seems really pretty, she said, when she had finished it. But it's rather hard to understand. You see, she didn't like to confess, even to herself, that she couldn't make it out at all. Somehow it seems to fill my head with ideas, only I don't exactly know what they are. So this idea that we are able to judge syntax, syntactic grammaticality, independently of meaning or function. And this is the way that the architecture of grammar is represented in generative grammar. So we have syntax, which is at the center, but then everything comes from the lexicon, so the lexical and functional items and features. And then we have the syntactic derivation, that's main component. But the interfaces also play an important role. So syntax at the end, before delivering the final outcome, has to interface with the phonological rules or phonological form, PF, and also with the logical form, so semantic rules, or LF. So I will go back to this point. So the importance of interfaces have been emphasized later again by Chomsky. So it's not only syntax is crucial, it's central, but it's not all about syntax. And now let's move to the main methodology used in generative grammar. So grammaticality intuitions and grammaticality judgments. So why do we need grammaticality judgments? So first of all, this competence can be seen as a window on the mind. So the aim is to establish what native speakers know about language. And this can mean different things. So we can establish whether a combination of elements is grammatical or ungrammatical, as already mentioned, like in 5 A and B are grammatical sentences because the word order follows the general principles and rules, syntactic rules of English, but 5C and D are not. But 6 is a similar example. So we have John often kisses Mary, which is grammatical, but John kisses often Mary is not grammatical, although 6b is the word order that we have in other languages like French or Italian, where adverbs usually follow the verb. So it's ungrammatical in one language, but could be grammatical in other languages. What we're also trying to establish is how syntax and semantics interact. Like in 7 and A and B, we have two sentences that are superficially identical, but semantically ambiguous. So I saw that gas can explode, or I saw that gas can explode. And we need to find a syntactic description that can correspond to the two possible meanings. And the same in 7b. Nikki saw the student with a telescope. With a telescope can refer to Nikki or to the student. And again, we need a syntactic description for the two meanings. But the reason why we ask grammatical judgments can also have to do with the different meanings associated with similar sentences. For instance, 8a and b add things that Alistair loves him, and in B, 8 things that Alistair loves himself. So him and himself have clearly different antecedents, so different references. And the aim of these grammaticality judgments is to try to understand these different meanings associated with sentences that can look superficially similar. So essentially, much of our knowledge is not so easily open to introspection as vocabulary. So when we are trying to describe or to define words, it's easier, but then it takes more teasing out before we are able to give grammatical judgments on syntax or interaction with syntax and semantics and so on. But what is surprising is that after reflection, speakers are able to give grammaticality judgments, and they usually agree, even if these sentences are not the usual subject of school instruction. And what is also important is to understand the place and what are grammaticality judgments within the theory. So we go from data to theory and then back to predictions on data. So the theory is trying to explain and predict the phenomena, and then we have the data, which are evidence for the phenomenon. And within this perspective, it's easy to confuse facts, so phenomena, and judgments. But we actually have to distinguish them, because the source of linguistic data, so the acts of judgments, are not the phenomena or the content, the target of what we are actually investigating. So essentially, generativists are not trying to understand what grammaticality judgments are. Grammaticality judgments are only used as evidence for phenomena, from linguistic phenomena that the theory is trying to explain. And sometimes there is a confusion about these two notions. So it's not the target of the theory of the analysis, but it's just the data providing evidence for phenomena. And of course, especially in specific cases, judgments are not the only possible source of data. We can use also psycholinguistic data, corpus studies, written grammars, and so on, especially when we don't have access to grammaticality judgments. For instance, if we're working on historical linguistics or with historic data. Two important notions about this methodology, so acceptability judgments, are that of acceptability and representativeness. So it's important to understand that this technique generally consists in asking a native speaker of a specific language if a determined sentence is acceptable. So if the speaker would normally produce or hear such a sentence, and acceptable is different from correct. So actually the method is asking whether one sentence is a natural, can be produced or heard in a spontaneous context. And also the acceptability judgments methodology is based on this idea that, of course, we are not just asking one speaker about the version of a language or idiolect, but we are taking that speaker to be representative of the internal grammar of a community, a specific community. So this was a central point, especially at the beginning of generative grammar. But as I said, then later there's been a kind of shift towards more quantitative studies. So to deal with more complex data. This methodology has been criticized because it doesn't deal with natural data, so with spontaneous data, but elicited in these artificial situations where you have a linguist asking for something, asking for the data. But at the same time, it also has some advantages. So it's possible to work with rare targets, so especially sentences or sentence types that rarely occur in spontaneous speech, but they're still necessary in order to compare syntactic configuration against other syntactic variables. Then it's also able to provide negative evidence, because sometimes we also need to be sure of what is impossible. So if a structure is considered to be unacceptable by speakers, and if we are only working with produced data, with corpora, then we can have positive evidence of a phenomenon, but not negative evidence. But negative evidence is also needed for the formal linguist to test hypotheses and to put forward relevant analysis of syntactic phenomena. And finally, especially in the experimental settings, the acceptability judgment task has been considered to be reliable and replicable, meaning that we can rely on the results, but most of all, we can repeat the method of data collection. So we can use the same speakers, different speakers from the same community, and try to repeat this acceptability judgment tasks and see whether we obtain similar or the same results. Let's now talk about syntactic variation. So usually when we talk about, when we speak about variation, maybe many linguists would think of sociolinguistics, which is the main area dealing with variation. But the difference between syntactic theory and sociolinguistics has to do with the different goals. So they use different approaches to the study of language. So if you remember the distinction between internal language and external language, sociolinguistics deals more with external language, and syntactic theory or generative grammar more with internal language. Sociolinguists have been against the claim that linguistics could be concerned with the ideal speaker-listener in a completely homogeneous speech community. So it's true, actually, that syntactic theory is mainly concerned with human competence and with the principles that can account for the grammatical constructions of a language in a homogeneous speech community. But at the same time, this does not amount to saying that syntactic theory ignores or dismisses linguistic variation entirely. And this is usually a common misconception about generative grammar. So generatives don't care, or they don't work with variation. In fact, one of the main framework within generative grammar, so principles and parameters, take the points of variation as very important for the syntactic theory. So according to Chomsky, all humans are genetically endowed with an innate ability to acquire language, so the universal grammar. And we find what is important about universal grammar is that we have principles, so which are invariant across languages. But at the same time, we have points of variation set during language acquisition, and these are called parameters. I will briefly give you a few examples of parameter, just to get an idea of the type of variation generative syntax has been dealing with. But these are like big differences typologically across languages. So first of all, the head parameter. So each phrase has a head, so the main unit of a phrase, and languages can differ according to the head parameter, so whether the heads of the constituents precede or follow the complements. So in this sense, for instance, English is a head initial language because all the heads precedes the complements, as we can see here for the prepositional phrase from Essex. So from is the preposition preceding the complement, and then the VP understand the lecture. So understand is the head, and then the complement follows. But Japanese is head final, so all heads follow the complements. So the equivalent for the preposition from would be after the complement. So Japan, from. Or if we have VP, the object precedes the verb. So the teacher, Taro, scold, So it would be S of the word order. Another parameter is the WH parameter, which has to do with the position of the WH pronouns in WH questions. So, and whether the WH question is being formed by moving the WH phrase to the beginning of the sentence, to the specifier of the complementizer phrase. So in English, this is the case. So in 11, we see the which book should we read, even if this is the direct object of the verb to read, appears at the beginning of the sentence. But then also if we have an embedded interrogative sentence, John wonders what Mary bought, what is the direct object of the verb to buy, but still appears at the beginning of the embedded clause. But Chinese and Japanese are WH in situ languages, so where WH phrases remain in the base position. So this is a similar example to 12, and we have the order Zhang San wonders what Lizzie bought what. So what stays in the object position. And finally, the null subject parameter. So here we have in 14, we have examples from Spanish and Italian. So Juan ha comprado el libro, John ha comprato il libro. So John has bought the book. So in this sentence, it is possible to drop the subject. Ha comprado el libro, ha comprato il libro. And this option is not possible in English. In English, we need to have the subject pronoun he. He has bought the book. So we can think of a principle. Actually, Chomsky thought of a principle according to which every clause must have a subject. But then this principle still holds in Spanish and Italian, where the subject position is filled by a null subject pronoun, which is usually called pro or little pro. Whether pro is available in a language is determined by the null subject parameter. So there are pro-drop languages and non-pro-drop languages, or null subject languages, which can have a null subject, and non-null subject languages, where actually the subject must be overt, explicitly expressed. And if we want to incorporate this variation, syntactic variation in syntactic theory, then there is this idea of parameter settings. So different parameter settings account for choices between possible structures or options in the grammar. So this idea that then children acquire language, they can set this parameter. So whether language is at head final, head initial, with WH movement, without, with null subjects or without, happens because of this parameter setting. So it's part of the syntactic theory. But this idea has also been applied, for instance, to non-standard varieties in dialects, like Belfast English in Henry's 2005 work. Another way to incorporate syntactic variation into syntactic theory has been to attribute the variation or the points of variation to differences in the feature specification of lexical and functional items. So this has been the case already in this minimalist program, Chomsky 1995, where general syntactic operations are included, and the variability is connected to the features of the lexical item. So remember, so in the lexicon, we have lexical item and functional items, which are specified for specific features. And when they enter syntax, they can have syntactic consequences, these features. And the idea of the features are important, so lexical and functional features are important, has also been adopted by theory of microparameters that was developed at the University of Cambridge by Ian Roberts or Anders Holmberg, according to which we can have parameters not just about big syntactic differences, but also at the micro level, and they have to do with feature specifications in the lexicon. Functional features are encoded in dedicated functional projections, and this is the idea, the main idea of the cartographic approach, so which is mapping the order and the hierarchy of the functional projections. So what the cartographic approach is trying to do is to assume that whenever there is a functional feature in syntax, so coming from the lexicon, this will be the head of a functional projection in the syntactic structure. So we will see now a couple of examples. And the idea is to have all possible functional projection in the structure in a specific hierarchy. So for instance, to the left, you see a minimalist kind of syntactic tree, where we have a complementizer phrase on the top, then tense phrase, and then the terminal phrase with Mary, ate is the verb, and then the complement churros. So this would be minimalist because it's only taken, developed within the minimalist program, it's only taking the core syntactic categories of CP, DP, TP, and P. But then if you see the part, I think I can do pointer. If you see this representation here, all these are functional projections related to mood specification, modality aspects, and they all represent the TP, the inflectional domain, according to Cinque 1999. So this is the cartographic approach, trying to say that whenever there is a specification, a functional specification for some property, which could be evaluation, evidentiality, epistemicity, there will be a functional projection in the representation. This is just a way to represent variation. And what is important is that if there is a language where there is a specific functional features, this has to be a place in the tree, and the tree will be the same for all languages, even if it looks admittedly quite complex. The same has been done for the left periphery, so for the CP. But in this case, what is important is the role of the interfaces. Already in the minimalist program, so it was given importance to the conditions imposed at the interfaces in order to understand the specificity of a language, so in order to understand variation. And this is taken by the cartographic approach as a way to say that discourse-related functional categories, such as focus and topic, are directly encoded in syntax. So they have a syntactic effect, syntactic impact, so they can be part of the syntactic representation. So as you can see here, we have topic projections, focus projections, and this is where these categories are encoded in the structure. Okay, and now let's move to the last part of this talk, which is about my early work on syntactic variation, so the two phenomena I mentioned, focus fronting and polar question particles. So let's start with focus fronting. So focus fronting was the main topic of my PhD thesis, but also my MA thesis. And in this case, the title of today's lecture, When the Answer You Seek is Within You, couldn't be more relevant. So because the starting points of my work were my own dialect, my own variety, and then I started from my own intuitions. Now, I don't know how many of you have been faced with the problem of choosing a topic for a thesis or dissertation. So I remember it was quite hard to come up with something original and also exciting and nice at the same time. And that was a really drama when I had to choose one for my MA thesis at the University of Siena. And then was really a kind of discovery, illumination. So is that generative grammar gave me all the possibility to use my own dialect, so Sicilian, which for me has never been a kind of advantage or anything, because I don't know if you're familiar with the sociolinguistic situation in Italy. Many dialects are usually stigmatized, so they're considered to be something inferior that you should not use in public, you should not use in formal contexts. And Siena is in Tuscany, which is the region that gave birth to Standard Italian. So whenever I was saying something, I was always careful not to be too substandard, too regional. But then I realized that there could be a kind of resource rather than something to be ashamed about. And that's what I did for my MA thesis and then also for my PhD thesis. And it was about this focus fronting phenomena. So for the method, I use grammaticality judgment. As I said, this is the main method in generative grammar, but mostly my own intuitions. So I'm sorry to say this, but it was mostly about me. So at this point of the dissertation, which was kind of a reassuring feeling, But of course, whenever I had doubts, I also consulted other native speakers of the same varieties. And for me, it was also something important to work on syntactic variation. And I have to say, all my professors at the University of Siena were very supporting and very excited to hear about this kind of variation. The way I incorporated this syntactic variation, I will tell you in a few minutes that Sicilian is different from Italian. That's the whole point. It's different from other Romance varieties with respect to focus prompting. And the way I try to incorporate this point of syntactic variation is to assume that there are two or more types of focus, and they are like functional features. They are active in syntax, so they are responsible for syntactic variation. So just a brief introduction to this notion of focus and focus prompting. Focus is a discourse-related notion, and the focus consisted of a sentence marked at all levels of the grammar. So with prosodic emphasis, pragmatically is the most relevant constituent, usually covering the new information. And if we look at syntax, sometimes, depends on the language, focus can also have syntactic effects. For instance, it can be placed in a dedicated position, so the end of the sentence or the beginning of the sentence. Now, in Italian, the focus constituent typically occurs post-verbally, as in 1a, hanno invitato Stefano alla festa, so immediately after the verb. But in some cases, and it's important to stress, some cases, it may be fronted, like in 1b, Stefano hanno invitato alla festa. So when is this option, the option 1b, this here, possible? What are the pragmatic conditions that allow focus prompting in Italian? Well, the traditional view is that, or was, that in Italian and also in other Romance languages, we need to have a contrastive interpretation, so kind of correction. So if somebody, speaker A, states, hanno invitato Paola alla festa, then speaker B can reply, Stefano hanno invitato alla festa, no Paola. So they invited Stefano to the party, no Paola. So speaker B is making a correction, and in this case, you can use focus prompting to convey this contrastive focus. But in Sicilian, focus prompting is different. It's more widespread. The focus of any sentence occurs at the beginning of the sentence in a preverbal position, independently of the presence of contrast or contrastive effects or corrections. And this happens with all types of constituents and in all sentence types. So the correction, the contrastive focus case, one will be the one in 4, where we have this correction. So they invited Paola to the party, and then somebody replies, a Stefano invitarono, no a Paola. So they invited Stefano to the party, not Italian, Paola. And this is like Italian. But then if we have a question, and the question is usually the more common elicitation method for focus, for neutral or information focus, a cum metaro a festa, who did they invite to the party? Then we can reply a Stefano invitato. So, and this is possible in Sicilian and perhaps in other varieties like Sardinian. What was really interesting, perhaps another discovery, is that Hungarian works quite similarly. So for me, it was quite intriguing to read the literature on Hungarian, especially by Katalin Ekish, and to read the context where focus prompting occurs. And these are very similar to the context where it happens in Sicilian. For instance, it's almost obligatory with quantifiers, with this kind of in replies to WH questions when people are introducing themselves. So if I want to say, it's me, it's Silvio, usually in Sicilian, in Hungarian, you say Silvio, it is, me, it is. So it was interesting to read about these comparisons, and I was guided by the studies on Hungarian to study the distribution of this phenomenon of focus prompting in Sicilian. So the main point is that we can distinguish two types of focus, and they have syntactic effects because they are different in one language and the other. So contrastive focus can be fronted in Italian, in Sicilian, but information focus can only be fronted in Sicilian. There are other syntactic differences connected to this distinction. So one is adjacency. Information focus must be adjacent to the verb, while contrastive focus need not be. Then the availability of focus fronting in embedded clauses. It is not available with information focus because the focus always has to target the main clause, so the matrix clause, but it is available with contrastive focus. And then also extractability across weak islands. And I will show you now examples of 1 and 2, but I will leave 3 out because it requires an introduction to weak islands, which I cannot do here. So adjacency, as I said, information focus must be adjacent to the verb. It means that there should not be anything, no constituent between the focus and the fronted focus and the verb. So if you have a question like, who did you give the keys to? I can reply, a Salvo, I dette, so to Salvo, I gave them. But I chiavi, so the keys cannot be between the focus and the verb. So the star between brackets indicates that this is not grammatical to put this constituent here. But it's possible with contrastive focus to have an intervening constituent between the focus and the verb. So a salvo I chiavi dette, no Pino. So to salvo the keys I gave, not to Pino. So this is one important syntactic difference, and then the availability in embedded context. So if I have a complex WH question with a matrix and an embedded clause like 7a, what does he want me to buy at the market? Then I can reply with focus fronting, but the focus, which originates from an embedded clause, has to move to the main clauses in the clause in the case of information focus. So I can only reply the almonds he wants that he buys for him. It cannot be in the embedded clause. Whereas this option is possible with contrastive focus. Volika I mennu le ciabatte, noi fastoche. So he wants that the almonds you buy for him, not the pistachios. Okay, so this is a syntactic difference showing that the difference between information focus and contrastive focus has not to do just with meaning, but also syntax. So this distinction has a syntactic impact. So starting from this point in the thesis, and that which then became a book, I was assuming that there are also 2 projections dedicated to this distinction, not just one focus projection, as in Ritz's representation of the left periphery, but 2, one for contrastive focus projection, information focus projection. There is also a third type of focus, which I labeled mirative focus, and this has to do with expression of surprise and unexpectedness. So this is not just new information, as with information focus, and it's not just contrastive. It doesn't have to be contrastive as with contrastive focus, unless we interpret it as contrast against expectations. But it's new information, which is at the same time unexpected and surprising, like in 9. Non ci posso credere, I can't believe it. 2 bottles we drank. So 2 bottiglie ci siamo bevuti. So this was unexpected. The unexpectedness will be related to the context. It could be the 2 bottles is too much. It could be the 2 bottles is too little. It depends on the people, on the background knowledge that we have. But this is something unexpected and surprising. And this also comes from an independent interest in typology. So at that time, I was also interested in evidentiality, and evidentiality is tightly connected to mirativity. So reading the literature, the typology literature of mirativity, so mirative markers in some languages where mirativity is grammaticalized, I noticed these interpretative similarities with focus fronting. And I will go back to this point in the next class, in the next lecture, because this is actually quite important for the rest of my work on focus fronting. So this is what will come next about focus fronting. I will talk about experimental studies on these types of focus in Italian, both in Spanish, and then the interaction with pragmatics and semantics, but also prosody, and finally also comparative analysis with other languages, so especially Catalan and Spanish. But now in the last 2 minutes, I will introduce the second phenomenon, so question particles, which was chapter 5 of my PhD thesis. And again, also in this case, the starting point was Sicilian, my own intuitions, but in this case, I also made a comparison with other Italian varieties, so I needed a questionnaire. So I used the acceptability judgments, but also a questionnaire for other varieties. In this case, what was really important is to see whether the presence or absence of this question particle was associated with a specific interpretive effect on the clause, so the meaning. Here you have two examples from Sicilian. Chi dicete vero? So where you have chi, remember chi looks like what, so that's why we label them what particles. Would be like what, you say real, are you being serious? Or what, or particle, you are tired, so are you tired? And it's found in Sicilian, but it's also found in many other dialects of Central and Southern Italy, including Tuscany and Rome. And as I said, in all varieties, this particle is homophonous to the WH word for what, and that's why we label them what particles in later work with Valentina Bianchi. So in this case, I had to use a questionnaire for the regional varieties of Italian spoken in Central Italy and Southern Italy. I was particularly interested in the word order, so syntactic properties, but also the semantic interpretation of this particle. So this would be an example from the questionnaire. So, che le hai prese le chiavi? So particle, did you take the keys? And it's important these distinctions actually came later because we can see some, in the results, some differences between the two groups. So in Central Italian varieties, we have a specific word order by which the word particle has to be at the beginning of the clause. And then it doesn't need to be adjacent to the verb. There could be a constituent between the particle and the verb, like in 13. Che le chiavi le hai prese? So what? Did you take the keys? And then for the semantic contribution, it seems that this is associated with a kind of presupposition that what I'm asking, I knew already about what I'm asking you, as a kind of request for a confirmation. But in Southern Italian varieties, it's slightly different. So the word particle can be preceded by a dislocated element like a topic, but it must be adjacent to the verb. So we cannot have le chiavi, so the keys here between the particle and the verb, but can be before or at the end of the sentence. But for the semantic contribution, something that for me was very kind of hard to accept is that I couldn't find any special interpretation associated with the presence of this particle. So I had to claim that it was a kind of optionality until in later work, I started to work on the interface with pragmatics together with Valentina Bianchi. And then thanks to a typology of question proposed by Farkas 2020, we came out with a distinction, with a possible explanation of the contribution, the pragmatic contribution of this particle. But this would be the subject topic for the third class, I think. And then in these cases, in later work, I used a better questionnaire specifically designed to test this typology of questions, and I had more specific survey points, but this will be next. But this is all for today, for tonight. Thank you. Now